The Pentagon just confirmed something that changes the entire technical picture of this war. American forces have started dropping 5,000-pound penetrator weapons directly into underground Iranian storage facilities. Purpose-built bombs specifically designed to punch through concrete and rock, and then keep functioning after they break through, detonating deep inside the tunnels Iran spent years building specifically to hide from exactly this kind of strike. Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane confirmed it himself at a Pentagon briefing alongside Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, describing weapons that are, in his words, bespokely designed to get through concrete and rock and function after penetrating those barriers. That's not vague, hedged Pentagon language. That's about as direct a confirmation as you'll ever get that the United States has shifted its entire targeting strategy away from just hitting what Iran keeps out in the open and started going straight for the hidden network underneath the entire country, the tunnels, the bunkers, and what analysts have started calling Iran's missile cities. A shift that fundamentally changes what winning this particular phase of the war actually looks like. Let's back up and actually explain what these missile cities even are, because understanding that is the key to understanding why this entire phase of the war looks so different from everything that came before it. For years, going back well before this current conflict ever started, Iran made a deliberate strategic choice to move almost its entire missile and drone production and storage infrastructure underground, carved into mountains, and buried beneath reinforced concrete, specifically to survive exactly the kind of airstrikes Iran knew it would eventually face from the United States or Israel. That decision traces directly back to painful lessons from the Iran-Iraq War, a brutal conflict during which Iranian cities and military sites were pounded relentlessly while Tehran lacked both modern air defenses and any real long-range strike capability of its own to answer back. That experience convinced Iran's leadership that above-ground facilities were essentially indefensible against a technologically superior adversary, and it planted the seed for a decades-long project of building an entire alternate military infrastructure underground, one that couldn't simply be spotted from satellite imagery and erased in a single afternoon of airstrikes. And the scale of what Iran actually built down there is genuinely staggering once you start digging into the specifics. These underground complexes aren't just storage depots. They're described by analysts as fully functioning production facilities, capable by some Israeli intelligence estimates of assembling hundreds of missiles and drones every single month, essentially entire assembly lines running continuously beneath solid rock, completely insulated from the kind of surface bombing campaigns that have devastated Iran's above-ground military infrastructure throughout this war. Multiple separate sites have been identified and targeted. An underground missile base near Isfahan, another near the town of Khomein, each one connected by tunnel networks with multiple separate entrances, specifically designed so that blocking one or two entry points wouldn't actually shut down the entire facility. A design philosophy that mirrors the kind of decentralized survivability planning militaries around the world have studied for decades, but rarely seen implemented at this scale by a single regional power. That redundancy is the whole point of the design. It's an engineering philosophy built around the assumption that some entrances will eventually get hit, so the facility as a whole needs to survive that loss and keep functioning anyway. Now here's where the story gets genuinely fascinating from a pure military engineering standpoint, because the initial American and Israeli strategy against these sites, going back to the earliest weeks of this conflict, focused heavily on blocking access rather than trying to fully collapse the tunnels themselves. At the Isfahan North Missile Base specifically, satellite imagery reviewed extensively by international media showed American and Israeli forces conducting repeated strikes aimed specifically at sealing off 4 separate tunnel entrances, with analysts counting at least 18 separate bomb craters concentrated around just 2 of those entry points alone. That's an enormous expenditure of munitions, aimed at a fairly narrow tactical objective, not destroying this facility outright, but making it physically impossible for Iran to get equipment and personnel in or out. And for a while, that approach looked like it was working exactly as intended. But then, something happened that genuinely surprised a lot of Western analysts, and it's worth understanding in detail because it explains exactly why the strategy has now shifted toward these deeper penetrator strikes. Iran started reopening those same tunnels using nothing more sophisticated than bulldozers and dump trucks. Satellite images captured in early May showed a dump truck actively working to fill in bomb craters at the Isfahan facility, while separate imagery from mid-April showed at least 10 separate pieces of construction equipment simultaneously clearing a blocked tunnel entrance near the Khomein site. Within a matter of weeks, roads that had been deliberately cratered and destroyed during the bombing campaign had been fully repaved, and previously sealed entrances had been reopened entirely. That's a remarkable, almost defiantly low-tech countermeasure to an enormously sophisticated and expensive American bombing campaign, proving that simply blocking the front door of a missile city doesn't actually stop what's happening inside it. It just creates a temporary inconvenience that a handful of construction vehicles and a few weeks of labor can undo. A genuinely humbling reminder that raw technological sophistication doesn't automatically guarantee a decisive, lasting advantage against an adversary willing to fall back on the simplest possible tools available. That specific vulnerability in the original strategy is exactly why this latest wave of strikes represents such a significant shift. Rather than continuing to target tunnel entrances that Iran has repeatedly proven it can simply reopen with basic construction equipment, American forces have moved toward directly penetrating the underground storage chambers themselves using these 5,000-pound bunker busters, weapons identified by defense analysts as almost certainly the GBU-72 Advanced 5K Penetrator, a precision-guided deep burial defeat weapon specifically engineered to punch through layers of rock and concrete before detonating on the other side, rather than simply exploding on impact at the surface. The GBU-72 was developed specifically to replace an older bunker buster that had been in continuous service since 1991, and the Air Force has stated it expects this newer weapon to offer substantially greater lethality against exactly the kind of deeply buried, heavily fortified targets Iran has spent decades constructing. Officials confirmed this specific weapon made its actual combat debut earlier in this conflict during strikes on hardened coastal missile sites near the Strait of Hormuz, and it's now become a central tool in this dramatically more aggressive phase of targeting Iran's underground network directly. Before going further into exactly how this latest round of strikes unfolded and what it's actually accomplished, it's worth pausing here, because if this kind of detailed breakdown of how American strategy has actually evolved over the course of this war is useful to you, drop a like on this one and subscribe, since there's a lot more nuance underneath this story than a simple headline about bunker busters can really capture on its own. Let's talk about the honest scorecard here, because it's important not to oversell how effective even this more aggressive underground targeting strategy has actually been. Independent research associates and weapons proliferation experts have raised real concerns that the continued threat posed by Iran's missile arsenal is being underestimated across Western media coverage, specifically because Iran doesn't need functioning production facilities to keep launching missiles in the near term. It simply needs surviving launchers and trained crews, both of which have proven considerably harder to fully eliminate than the storage facilities themselves. Even during the earlier, more intense phase of this conflict, when American and Israeli forces reportedly destroyed more than 300 separate mobile missile launchers, that still left the vast majority of Iran's estimated 3,000 missile arsenal intact and dispersed, hidden using tactics that go well beyond simply parking equipment inside mountain tunnels. CENTCOM released thermal imaging footage earlier in this war, showing exactly how sophisticated that dispersal strategy has become. Mobile launchers, tucked under highway bridges, concealed beneath tree cover, positioned inside ordinary-looking urban buildings, essentially scattering Iran's remaining strike capability across hundreds of individually unremarkable locations, rather than concentrating it in facilities large enough to show up clearly on satellite imagery. That dispersal strategy is really the core reason this entire underground bunker story matters so much, because it explains exactly why the war has dragged on for months rather than being resolved in the opening weeks the way the initial coordinated strikes might have suggested. This entire operation, which officials have referred to throughout as Operation Epic Fury, began in the pre-dawn hours of February 28, 2026, with a coordinated wave of American and Israeli strikes that hit an enormous range of targets simultaneously. Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps command and control facilities, naval assets, underground sites tied to Iran's nuclear program, air defense systems, missile and drone launch sites, and military airfields, all struck within the same opening operation. That first wave was genuinely devastating in scope, and according to a senior Israeli official, it included a strike that killed nearly 50 senior Iranian regime officials in under 50 seconds during the operation's opening moments, a strike made possible in part by a deliberate deception campaign that included carefully timed public statements specifically designed to convince Iranian leadership that no immediate attack was actually coming, with top commanders reportedly even sent home the night before as part of the same elaborate deception effort. Iran's supreme leader had reportedly spent millions of dollars over several years constructing his own underground bunker specifically to survive an attack like this, a fortified compound spanning multiple streets beneath the heart of Tehran, with numerous entrances and meeting rooms. And according to Israeli officials, that specific bunker was never even used because leadership believed no one had the resolve to actually strike them directly. The Israeli Defense Forces later announced they had fully dismantled that same underground compound entirely, releasing illustrated footage showing the network of entry points scattered across the city that once fed into it. So if the opening strikes of this conflict were genuinely that devastating, hitting leadership, command structures, and above-ground infrastructure all at once, why has the underground missile city problem persisted for months afterward, rather than being resolved quickly? The answer comes back to exactly the redundancy and dispersal philosophy Iran built these facilities around in the first place. Destroying leadership and above-ground infrastructure, however dramatic and consequential, doesn't automatically destroy a network of hardened underground production and storage sites built specifically to survive exactly that kind of decapitation strike. Iran's entire military doctrine around these missile cities was built on the explicit assumption that leadership might be killed, that command structures might be disrupted, but that the underlying industrial capacity to keep producing and launching missiles needed to survive independently of any single point of failure, distributed widely enough and buried deeply enough that no single strike, however overwhelming, could eliminate the whole capability at once. It's worth understanding exactly why the GBU-72 represents such a meaningful upgrade over what American forces had available before, because the engineering specifics actually matter a lot here. The weapon this newer penetrator was built to replace had been in continuous American service since 1991, more than 3 decades of steady use against hardened targets around the world. But 3 decades is also more than enough time for adversaries like Iran to study exactly how that older weapon performed and design their underground facilities specifically to survive it, building deeper, adding additional layers of reinforced concrete, and spacing out vulnerable points, specifically based on the known performance characteristics of a weapon whose specifications had become fairly well understood over that many years of use. The GBU-72 breaks that pattern of predictability, using GPS guidance paired with a high explosive warhead specifically optimized for detonation after penetration rather than on impact, which matters enormously against a target built with defensive assumptions calibrated around an older weapon's known limitations. It's essentially the difference between an adversary building defenses around a threat it fully understands versus suddenly facing a meaningfully upgraded version of that same threat, one that potentially reaches depths and defeats reinforcement levels the original facility designs never accounted for. Let's get into the more recent operational details, because the pace and intensity of strikes against this underground network has genuinely escalated over just the past several weeks. CENTCOM officially completed its 8th consecutive night of strikes against Iran on July 18th, and continued that sustained tempo through a 12th consecutive night by July 22nd, with official releases confirming American forces struck maritime capabilities, missile and drone storage facilities, coastal surveillance sites, and air defense assets across multiple Iranian cities simultaneously, with explosions specifically reported in the southern cities of Sirik and Bushehr. That pace of nightly operations, sustained for nearly 2 full weeks straight, represents a level of continuous pressure that goes well beyond the kind of periodic, isolated strikes that characterized earlier phases of this conflict. And it's precisely this sustained tempo that eventually created the conditions for the deeper penetrator strikes against underground storage specifically, since each night of suppression, work against surface-level air defense and radar assets steadily cleared the way for the more difficult, higher-value strikes against the hardened facilities underneath. And then, just as it looked like this might be settling into a grinding but stable pattern, Iran broke the rhythm entirely. In an attempted surprise attack, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces launched multiple ballistic missiles from Iran, targeting American forces based in the Middle East, an attack Axios reported was specifically directed at a U.S base in Jordan. Every single one of those missiles was successfully intercepted, according to CENTCOM, and Jordan's own armed forces separately confirmed their air defenses, intercepted 5 additional missiles launched during that same window. A clean interception record that speaks to how much layered air defense capability has been built up across the region over the course of this sustained conflict. But the fact that Iran attempted this kind of direct, unprovoked strike during what had briefly become a multi-day pause in the broader fighting signals something important, that Tehran's willingness to restart hostilities on its own terms hadn't actually diminished despite the sustained pressure of the underground bunker campaign, according to a retired U.S official who described this specific attack as breaking the established pattern of Iran only responding after American strikes rather than initiating an attack unprompted, a distinction that matters because it suggests Iran's leadership still believes it retains meaningful strategic options even after weeks of sustained bombardment against its most hardened infrastructure. President Trump's response to that surprise attack was about as blunt as presidential rhetoric gets, telling reporters aboard Air Force One that Iran was, in his words, going to get a beating and promising heavy retaliatory strikes. And the retaliation that followed matched that rhetoric in scale, if not in language, with CENTCOM confirming a 2-hour-long wave of strikes hitting dozens of Revolutionary Guard targets across Iran simultaneously, including military command centers, missile and drone facilities, coastal surveillance and defense sites, and maritime capabilities, all struck within the same coordinated operation. Iran's Revolutionary Guard responded to that retaliatory wave, with its own defiant statement vowing to punish what it called the aggressor and warning that any nation assisting the United States could face what it described as a harsh response, while separately insisting it maintains full control of the Strait of Hormuz and warning that outside powers thousands of kilometers away would not be allowed to interfere in the waterway. Rhetoric that has become almost ritualistic at this point in the conflict, but still carries real weight, given Iran's demonstrated willingness to follow through on at least some of it. Let's talk about one of the more remarkable individual strikes buried inside all of this back and forth, because it's a genuinely dramatic story on its own that connects directly back to the underground bunker theme running through this entire conflict. During a rescue operation for downed American aircrew after a U.S. fighter jet was shot down over Iranian territory, sources told reporters that the commander of U.S. Central Command received time-sensitive intelligence indicating a large number of senior Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders were gathered inside an underground facility near Tehran, essentially serving as a wartime headquarters. Rather than waiting, the CENTCOM commander directed B-2 bombers to fly a full round-trip mission from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, specifically to strike that facility, using the same massive ordnance penetrator bunker buster bombs that were used in an earlier, separate operation against Iran's nuclear sites. According to a senior military source, the strike obliterated that IRGC headquarters entirely. And in a detail that captures just how intense that specific operational window actually was, B-1 bombers separately dropped 100 individual 2,000-pound bombs specifically to keep Iranian forces away from the active rescue site, while American Special Operations Forces worked to extract the downed aircrew, an enormous expenditure of ordnance dedicated purely to protecting a rescue operation happening in real time, while a completely separate strike against a hardened underground command bunker was unfolding practically simultaneously just a short distance away. Two entirely different combat operations layered on top of each other within the same few tense hours. There's also a human cost dimension worth addressing directly, because Iranian state media and allied outlets, including Russia's Sputnik, have consistently framed these strikes as indiscriminately aggressive, pointing specifically to disputed claims of civilian casualties, including one contested incident near a girls' school that drew significant international attention and condemnation. It's genuinely difficult to independently verify the full civilian cost of a bombing campaign this sustained and this geographically widespread from outside sources alone. And honest coverage of this conflict has to acknowledge that gap rather than simply accepting either side's framing uncritically. What can be said with more confidence is that a campaign specifically targeting facilities buried beneath population centers and dispersed throughout ordinary civilian infrastructure, precisely because Iran deliberately built its missile program that way to complicate targeting, inherently carries meaningfully elevated risk to civilians compared to strikes against isolated military installations in open terrain. And that's a genuine cost of Iran's own dispersal strategy, playing out in real time, not merely a talking point from either side of this conflict. Now, here's the honesty check, because it's important to hold two things as true at the same time, rather than collapsing this story into either pure triumph or pure futility. On one hand, the technical and operational picture here is genuinely impressive. American forces have successfully struck and destroyed specific high-value underground facilities, including at least one confirmed IRGC command headquarters, using precision penetrator weapons specifically engineered for exactly this kind of hardened target, and the shift toward direct penetration rather than simply blocking tunnel entrances represents a meaningful tactical evolution that should, over time, prove considerably harder for Iran to simply bulldoze its way around the way it did with the earlier entrance blocking strategy. On the other hand, the broader strategic picture remains genuinely unresolved because Iran's underlying missile production philosophy was specifically designed around distributed redundancy rather than centralized vulnerability, meaning that even successfully destroying individual facilities, however dramatic and however well executed, doesn't automatically translate into eliminating Iran's overall capability to keep producing and launching missiles, particularly given how effectively Iran has already demonstrated it can disperse mobile launchers into ordinary civilian infrastructure, where they become extraordinarily difficult to locate and target with any kind of penetrator weapon at all. That tension between genuinely impressive tactical successes against specific hardened targets and the much harder, unresolved strategic question of whether Iran's broader missile capability can actually be eliminated rather than merely degraded and dispersed is really the honest state of this entire underground campaign right now. It's not a story with a clean, satisfying resolution either way. It's a genuinely contested, ongoing technical and tactical fight, where both sides have shown real adaptability. American forces evolving their targeting strategy in direct response to Iran's low-tech but effective countermeasures, and Iran continuing to demonstrate that decades of deliberate, redundant infrastructure planning, built specifically around surviving exactly this kind of sustained bombing campaign, doesn't collapse easily even under enormous and sustained military pressure. There's also an intelligence dimension to this campaign that deserves real attention, because finding these hidden facilities in the first place is arguably a harder and more consequential problem than actually destroying them once located. Iran has had decades to perfect the art of concealment, building tunnel entrances that blend into natural rock formations, routing ventilation and support infrastructure to avoid obvious surface signatures, and deliberately spacing entrances far enough apart that satellite imagery analysis alone struggles to connect them as parts of the same underlying facility. Overcoming that level of deliberate concealment requires layering multiple different intelligence sources together, satellite imagery tracking construction activity and vehicle movement patterns over months or years, human intelligence from sources inside or near these facilities, signals, intelligence picking up communications, traffic tied to specific locations, and increasingly, the kind of drone-based persistent surveillance that can watch a suspected site for extended periods without the obvious signature of a manned reconnaissance flight. The strike that took out the IRGC headquarters near Tehran during that rescue operation is a perfect example of exactly this kind of intelligence fusion in action. Time-sensitive information about senior commanders gathering inside a specific underground location, precise enough and trusted enough that CENTCOM's commander was willing to redirect B-2 bombers on a full round-trip mission from Missouri, specifically to act on it within a matter of hours rather than days. Let's talk about what this actually means going forward, because the trajectory here matters just as much as the individual strikes themselves. If American forces continue shifting further toward direct penetration of underground storage, rather than surface-level entrance blocking, expect the total number of confirmed underground facility destructions to keep climbing, alongside continued expansion of operations further east into Iranian territory. Exactly the pattern General Kane described when he confirmed American forces are expanding operations progressively deeper into the country, rather than remaining concentrated near the coastline where this conflict initially focused most heavily. That expansion matters because it suggests American planners increasingly believe the coastal and near-border facilities have been sufficiently degraded to justify pushing resources toward targets deeper inland, precisely the kind of harder-to-reach, more heavily fortified sites that would have been considered too costly or too risky to prioritize during the earlier phases of this campaign. At the same time, expect Iran to keep leaning even harder into exactly the dispersal and low-tech resilience tactics that have already proven effective throughout this war. More mobile launchers, hidden in civilian infrastructure, continued rapid reconstruction efforts at any facility that survives a strike in a repairable state, and continued reliance on the sheer scale of its original 3,000 missile arsenal to absorb losses that would cripple a smaller, less distributed force. That's really the core dynamic defining this entire phase of the conflict, a technologically sophisticated American penetration campaign going up against a deliberately low-tech, deliberately redundant Iranian survival strategy that was specifically designed decades in advance for exactly this kind of confrontation. And neither side has yet demonstrated a clean, decisive advantage capable of ending this particular dimension of the war outright, which is exactly why so much of the recent coverage keeps circling back to the same underlying question of whether depth and precision can ultimately outpace sheer redundancy and dispersal. It's also worth putting this specific underground campaign into the context of what it costs to actually sustain, because operations at this scale and this intensity don't come cheap, and that cost calculus matters for how long a campaign like this can realistically continue at its current pace. A single B-2 mission, flying round-trip from Missouri specifically to strike one target, as happened during that IRGC headquarters strike, represents an enormous logistical and financial undertaking on its own. Tanker support stretched across an entire ocean crossing, an aircraft that costs a substantial fraction of $1 billion per unit risked on a single mission, and munitions themselves that run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars per individual penetrator bomb. Multiply that by the sustained tempo of 12 consecutive nights of strikes, each involving multiple aircraft, multiple munitions, and the enormous supporting infrastructure of tankers, intelligence platforms, and suppression missions required to clear a safe path for every strike package, and you start to understand why sustaining this kind of campaign indefinitely becomes as much a question of economic and logistical endurance as it is a question of pure military capability. That's part of why the shift toward more precisely targeted, higher-value underground strikes, rather than broader, less discriminating bombing campaigns, matters so much strategically, because it represents an attempt to maximize the actual damage done per extremely expensive mission flown, squeezing more strategic value out of every sortie rather than simply sustaining sheer volume indefinitely. There's also a broader question worth sitting with here about what actually constitutes success in a campaign like this, because the traditional measures of military victory, territory captured, enemy forces destroyed in open engagement, don't map cleanly onto a fight that's fundamentally about hunting down and eliminating a deliberately scattered, deliberately hardened production and storage network. Success here looks less like a single decisive battle and more like a slow, grinding accumulation of individual facility destructions, each one meaningful on its own, but none of them alone sufficient to end Iran's underlying capability, a war of attrition against infrastructure rather than against a conventional fighting force, and that kind of campaign, by its very nature, tends to be measured in months and years, rather than in the kind of decisive weeks that characterized the opening strikes of this conflict back in February. There's one more angle worth exploring before getting to where all of this actually leaves the conflict, and that's the question of what Iran's continued reliance on this underground missile city model actually tells you about the regime's broader strategic thinking. Choosing to spend decades and enormous sums of money building an entire alternate military infrastructure underground, rather than investing more heavily in modern air defense capable of actually preventing strikes from reaching Iranian airspace in the first place, reflects a specific strategic bet that Iran would never be able to match the air power of the United States or Israel directly, and that the more realistic path to strategic survival lay in simply outlasting any bombing campaign by building infrastructure resilient enough to survive it. That bet has been partially validated by this conflict, given how effectively Iran has repaired blocked tunnel entrances and dispersed launchers into civilian infrastructure. But it's also being partially disproven in real time by exactly the kind of deeper penetration strikes now underway. Weapons specifically engineered to defeat the very depth and reinforcement that Iran's entire strategy was built around. Whether that underlying strategic bet ultimately pays off or ultimately fails is really the central question this entire underground campaign is working to answer, one bunker at a time. So where does this leave things right now? The Pentagon has confirmed a genuine, significant shift in tactics, moving from blocking access to Iran's underground missile cities toward directly penetrating and destroying the storage chambers themselves using purpose-built 5,000-pound bunker busters. And that shift has already produced confirmed successes, including the destruction of at least one major IRGC underground command headquarters. But the broader strategic contest over Iran's dispersed missile capability remains genuinely unresolved, with Iran continuing to demonstrate real resilience through low-tech countermeasures and aggressive dispersal tactics that have repeatedly complicated even the most sophisticated American targeting efforts. Whether this newer, deeper penetration strategy ultimately proves decisive, or whether it becomes just the latest chapter in a much longer campaign of measured, incremental attrition against a deliberately redundant underground network, is genuinely still an open question. And it's one that will likely keep shaping how this entire conflict unfolds over the coming weeks and months, particularly as American forces continue expanding operations further inland, and Iran continues testing exactly how far it can push its own surprise attacks before triggering an even heavier response than the one it's already absorbed. What do you think? Does this shift toward direct underground penetration finally give American forces a decisive edge against Iran's missile cities? Or do you think Iran's decades of deliberate redundancy planning mean this becomes another long, grinding phase of a war that keeps finding new ways to persist? Let us know what you think down in the comments, because the technical and strategic questions underneath this story are exactly the kind that deserve careful, informed discussion, rather than a simple verdict either way. And there's genuinely reasonable room to land on either side of this, depending on how much weight you put on tactical wins versus the harder, slower grind of strategic attrition. And if breaking down exactly how modern military campaigns actually unfold, tactic by tactic, target by target, rather than just reacting to a single dramatic headline, is the kind of analysis you want more of, go ahead and subscribe. And share this with anyone who's been trying to understand what's actually happening underneath the surface of this conflict, quite literally. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll keep tracking this one closely as it continues to develop, since every new round of CENTCOM press releases and every fresh piece of satellite imagery tends to shift this picture at least a little, and it's worth staying on top of exactly how that picture keeps evolving, rather than relying on whatever snapshot of the conflict happened to be the loudest headline on any given week.